when you got in here today and you went back and you got your food, you had a choice, right? You got your utensils and you have a fork and a knife. So really, when you think about Scrum and Kanban, it's like choosing a fork and a knife. You're using them both to eat, right? So you're going to use them both to, manage your agile processes, but you use them for different things. So they're two different tools that you actually use differently, but the outcome is the same. You want to have the value brought to the teams, and you want to manage your projects efficiently. So when you think about it, the end goal is the same, but there's just two very different tools. So that's kind of what the focus is going to be of our conversation today, is to go over the uses of both of these tools, but then have you be able to make the choice of which one to select. So a little bit about Matrix. John introduced us pretty well. We've been around since 1983, so 33 years of experience. We are headquartered in Atlanta, and we do focus on technology staffing and consulting, and then of course we've got our Agile Solution Practice business. So our Agile Consulting practice, we do have a professional services group of a group of Agile coaches. We're all trained to do consulting along with training, leading sessions, and then also we're very skilled in enterprise agile delivery and transformation consulting. So all of the contemporary topics for some of the large-scale hyper-growth companies here in the Bay Area are topics that we do cover. And when I do my presentation today, I am going to go over a lot of the basics of Scrum and Kanban. So for those of you who are a little bit newer to Scrum and Kanban, which I don't see too many of you in the crowd that are, but I did talk to a couple of folks that are a little bit new. So you will get some of the basics, but I'm also going to target the conversation for an enterprise agile delivery focus, because really when you're using all of these tools, you're using them in a very large-scale integrated environment. So knowing the right tool to use in each one of those situations is really important. So that will be, sort of the focus. So a little bit about myself. Besides the fact that I can sail and, sail up to 60 feet, I am the Agile practice leader here for the Matrix San Francisco Center of Excellence. So I am the practice leader. I also am on the Agile Advisory Board for the UC Berkeley Agile Project Management Program, so I actually teach next door. So I work next door on the second floor, and then I teach upstairs on the 5th and the 6th floor, so I can just get on the elevator and go up and teach my classes when I have them next fall. So at any rate, I do teach some of the programs there. I'm also an active member of the Agile Alliance, and I am speaking next week at the Agile Conference. My paper was accepted for submission, and I am a member of the Project and Portfolio Management track, so I'm one of the leaders for that track. So that's a little bit about me. And then I also have a very lean focus. I have a Six Sigma black belt. So I basically like to apply a lot of lean practices to my Agile delivery. So that's why we're really getting into the topic of Scrum versus Kanban today, because it's really a topic in terms of getting the lean practices and lean principles into Agile delivery that's very close to my heart. So for our agenda today, we'll start out with our introduction. So basically, we'll give a little bit of background of an introduction of Lean and Agile, Scrum and Kanban, all of those things. But we're also going to talk about the use in an enterprise environment, which, as I said, is very important, because the reality is in these larger scale enterprise environments and in companies such as that are in the San Francisco Bay Area that are in a hyper-growth mode, which is just more growth than companies can keep up with, that they have to use a blended technique of both Scrum and Kanban in order to make things run efficiently. So the reality is you really do need both. Scrum alone is not going to be able to survive in an enterprise agile environment. So, and we'll see in a lot of the models that are out there, we'll talk about Dean's SAFE model, Dean Leffingwell's SAFE model. We'll talk a little bit about Scrum and Scale, so we'll get kind of an overview about how some of the thought leaders are handling Agile Enterprise at Scale, and then talk about how that really is a blended Scrum and Kanban environment. So let's get into the Agile values and the Agile Manifesto.
On February 11th through 13th, 2001, at the Lodge of Snowbird Ski Resort in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah, 17 people met to talk, ski, relax, and try to find common ground. And what emerged was the Agile Manifesto.
Individuals and interactions versus people and processes. So individuals and interactions are more important than people and processes. It's not, it's not that the processes go away, or not that the processes and tools go away, but that the individuals are what's really more important. And then the next thing is working software over comprehensive documentation. So for an agile delivery, you want to get out working software at a rapid cadence. So every 2 to 3 weeks, you want to be able to deliver software and have it presented to the customer in a manner where you're delivering value first. And then the next area is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So the ability to get the team to come together and collaborate and really use all the talents of each member of the team rather than spending time, negotiating over a contract, is really valued in the Agile community. And every person on the team is an important member, and having that collaboration is really what gets the product, of the highest quality, because you're using really all of the talents and skills of your entire team to deliver the solution. And then lastly, responding to change over following a plan. So in the Agile world, change is welcomed, and really, the ability of the team to embrace change and be able to respond to it in a manner that's going to provide more value and actually more productivity is what's really going to, at the end of the day, provide more value to the customer. So again, everything on the right-hand side in this model is still there. So the reality is that, there's no perfect world out there where it's all going to be items to the left. But in the Agile world, it's the items on the left that you want to embrace more than the items on the right. So what is Scrum? So for those of you who are here, I think probably all of you know what Scrum is. It's a very cyclical framework where you go in and you get into an iterative process where you actually go through a whole cycle. So in the waterfall world, what's at the bottom here, the planning, the design, code, test, and then all of the testing to get to delivery can take months in each phase. But in Agile, you do all of it in a short time box phase of anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, ideally. And that time varies from customer to customer, in terms of what makes more sense for them to process. But in terms of what's important here is the fact that it is a very iterative process, and it is able to handle everything in order to build a product that actually provides value to the end customer. So Scrum at scale. So Jeff Sutherland came up with Scrum at scale in his response to Dean. So of course we all know about Dean, Leffing, Well, and Safe, and he's doing very well with that, as we all know. I'm an SPC myself, so Dean does phenomenally well with doing all the training for Safe. So Jeff Sutherland came up with Scrum at scale in a response to that, and basically what he's done is replicate the Scrum pattern. So we talked about the Scrum pattern, but what the iteration is on a larger scale. So when teams do something really well, such as backlog grooming, such as good stand-up, such as having good collaboration and things like that, they want to do more of it. And they want to put that in a template so that they can easily replicate that. So when things, when the company scales quickly, they want to have a model. So you're basically creating a die here, is what you're doing with the Scrum at scale model. So rather than having a backlog of features and things like that you're putting into software, what you have here is a backlog of patterns. And so the patterns are the good practices that you want to do all the time. And you want every team to do the same so that you have a highest quality product delivered and rapidly, and you're able to scale rapidly. So that's what we're talking about here with the Agile Scrum at scale model here, is that he's just gone through and created an iterative model, but on a larger scale with patterns. And then from there, you're going into, transformation heartbeat. So the team works on a cadence where they're actually producing software rapidly, based upon their agreed upon cycle of either 2 to 4 weeks to get their sprints out, and then they're producing their product. And then so you've got the team cadence, and then you've got the daily cadence. So the daily cadence are your practices like your stand-ups, and if you're doing continuous delivery, how you're getting your branches out and things like that. So those are your daily practices. And then of course you've got your practices of things that you're doing at the beginning and the ends of the sprints. And then from there, you're going to take actionable metrics from each sprint, and then you're going to now learn and then incorporate that into your pattern. So you're going to take the validated learning, and then you're going to alter your patterns based on what's necessary. Okay, so that's a little bit about Scrum and Scale. Again, it's an overview of what we're talking about here for the model. And what Jeff Sutherland has done has used a lot of lean startup principles here. So basically the validated learning is a concept from the lean startup model where you actually not ask, how to build a product, but if you should build a product, and then take the validated learnings from there and then put that into the model. So that's how he's using the validated learning to go into the strategy here. So one item that's actually a good pattern and an anti-pattern. So we talked about patterns, but we didn't talk about anti-patterns. So an anti-pattern is behavior you don't want to repeat. So something that's considered to be a good pattern and a good anti-pattern can have to do with culture. So you can have your culture set up so that it embraces Agile, or you can have a very resistant culture where it doesn't embrace Agile at all. So an example of an anti-pattern you wouldn't want to see is that you send everybody to Scrum Master training, and then they all come back and they still say, well, we don't want to use Agile in our organization, right? So that's considered an anti-pattern. But then the good culture is when everybody from the leadership all the way down to the teams are all embracing Agile. So that's what you want to see. So what we have here is what's called the Schneider model. And so basically what this talks about is a continuum. So the behavior on the right is really going more towards the anti-pattern, where you have things that are more of a command and control environment that are really looking at ways to do control. And then down in the bottom part of the quadrant there, you see the competence. So when teams think that they have to be number one to succeed, when everybody's competing against each other without really collaborating, those are the behaviors that are considered anti-patterns. And then when you go to the left-hand side now, these are the topics and the areas that you want to see in a good Agile environment. So you want the people-centric types of items. So you want to see collaboration, where everyone on the team is working together and collaborating in a fashion to actually build a good, good product together. And then down in the left-hand side on the bottom left content, the cultivation, where you're creating a learning organization where knowledge is just automatically generated is the ideal state you want to get to. So the collaboration is good, but then cultivation and actually getting to the point where teams, continue to work together and knowledge is automatically being produced without even any effort and just being pulled is the ideal state. So for transformation at scale, for all the larger companies here in the Bay Area, we've got LinkedIn, we've got Google, we've got all these folks that have experienced phenomenal growth, Twitter. What they have to do is be able to scale rapidly. So what that means is they need to be able to put infrastructure in. So we're talking about the hardware, we're talking about the networks, we're talking about the servers, the cloud, all of that sort of information. But along with that too, we have to have the cultural changes, and the whole organization from the leadership team all the way down to the teams all needs to be able to embrace an Agile environment in order to be able to scale up quickly. So, thinking again about the Scrum at Scale from Sutherland, that you have to have that behavior in a template and be able to rapidly produce it for these hyper-growth companies. Otherwise, they're just not going to be able to survive or scale up rapidly, successfully, because they don't have a good pattern. If they have a bad pattern and they repeat it in a exponential fashion, then they could actually have very disastrous consequences to their company. So it's very important that they have the good patterns in place and the good behaviors when it comes to Agile. So getting back to the Scrum and Kanban, so the reality is that for these enterprise environments, we have a mixed environment. So what we see here up at the top is a Kanban. So at the portfolio level, what you have is a backlog of portfolio items. So the leadership team goes through and will work with each other and prioritize items in the backlog just like they would at the team level. But with the Kanban approach, and we'll learn a little bit more about that as we get through the presentation, items are actually pulled when there is capacity for team members to be able to do the work. And that helps optimize waste. So that's the reason why at the portfolio level, the Kanban approach is important. And just like you had sandwiches today, right? This is called the Kanban sandwich. So you've got a little bit of Kanban here at the higher level, the portfolio level, along with your infrastructure, which is your BAU, support backlog, business as usual. So these are your support items coming in. This is your infrastructure demands for these large growing companies. So they're using Kanban because that's the most efficient way to get the work done, where you can get things pulled in, items are sized appropriately, knowing what the team can do, and things like putting in networks, putting in servers, can be relatively estimated quickly. You can tell that it might take an hour to put in a computer or set up software or something like that. So things like that tend to lend itself well to Kanban and be able to put into a backlog. And then in the middle of this Kanban sandwich here, you've got your Scrum activities. So you've got your team activities with your regular stand-ups, your regular software delivery, where you're delivering value to the customer based on your backlog of items. So you're still using the Agile techniques, you're still using Scrum, but you're using them in a blended environment. And that's what's really important, and it's what the reality of today's environments are, is that the blended environments are working. So looking at the SAFE model, so this is Dean's approach to Agile at scale. So Dean's approach to Agile at scale is what's called the SAFE model, or the Scaled Agile Framework. How many of you folks are familiar with SAFE? A few of you, okay. So it's basically just a model that's used. Where it came about from was Dean is a well-traveled world consultant, and he's put in a lot of enterprise Agile implementations. So it was his take at a template or a model that can be used for larger scale enterprise organizations. My experience has been with SAFE implementations that I've done is that we start here, but then it's customized for each environment, because there is not truly a one-size-fits-all. But what this is a good start. So it is that good template, or that good die that we talk about, that can be used to help guide an enterprise transformation. So what you have at the top here is, and just like we saw in the last slide, the top layer of the Kanban sandwich. So at the portfolio level, we've got a Kanban board being used to pull in items where the leadership team is actually selecting initiatives, and they may have, say, a top 5 initiatives to work through that year. And they're going to go in and size them, just like you would any other backlog, but they're going to use Kanban techniques. So only when the teams have capacity to be able to take on the work, then they're actually pulled into the organization here at the enterprise level. And then from that point, you're going down into the program level, where now all of these major portfolio initiatives are now being put into a program. And with this good set of standards and practices and patterns that you're using, in SAFE, what you do is create what's called a release train. So for example, if you have a company that releases 3 times a year like Salesforce does, what you're going to want to do is get all your projects or all your programs to try to release at the same time. And you want to have them in a consistent delivery. So what you do is you put everything into an Agile release train, where you get all of these projects consolidated and rolled up and put into the release train and delivered. And then that way you have your uniform delivery, you've got your quality, you've got your, your speed to value. And that way you can recognize value and then reduce waste and improve quality in the organization. And then down here at the team level, you've got your regular business as usual with Scrum, where you've got your multiple Scrum teams now. So, with the scaled Agile environment now, you've got the multiple Agile teams working, and then they're all working together, and then they're going to deliver and then move things up to the program level. And there's a lot more detail we could go into this. We do have, other trainings on SAFe, but this is really about, the differences between Scrum and Kanban. So we're gonna, move on towards that. But I can certainly answer any questions offline that anybody has about SAFe or wants to know. But there is, like I said, a lot more detail to it. This is just the high level 20,000 foot overview. But it sort of sets the stage for really why we need to have both Scrum and Kanban in an enterprise environment, because it really is necessary in order for things to run efficiently. So now getting into Lean Kanban, so let's talk about it a little bit. So the first thing you want to have with Lean Kanban is to be able to visualize your workflow. So for each item of work that your team is doing, what that means is you want to have the Kanban board up or visible. So, generally having the big visibles that are, available for your team, having the individual queue set up that has each one of your work items, and, making sure that you have captured all of your tasks is very important. The second item is limiting the work in process. So for each one of the queues, and we'll see an example of that, the difference between Scrum and Kanban there is, for Scrum you have queues and you move things from queue to queue. But with Kanban, you can actually set a WIP level. So for example, if you have 5 developers and you have your development queue, you might set the WIP to 5 there, because you would know that people could only work on 5 programs at a time. That's just a very simplistic, example of that. But say, all of a sudden you backed up to having 10 items in there, then, in software like Jira or Rally, the queue would turn red. So what you have there is a problem, with your queue, and then what's known as a bottleneck in Kanban, and then you would go address it and try to find the root cause of the problem and fix that. But so that's the value of setting the WIP levels there. And then the fact that you know what the team can produce, so you set those WIP levels to actually keep the flow going through the system. Because in a Kanban system, what's really important is keeping the flow going from queue to queue to queue to get your work completed in an efficient manner. And then measuring and optimizing the flow, again, like I said, having things move through the system is very important. The ability to keep that cadence, keep that rhythm, so that you don't have too many items that are backed up in any one area, and that when you have several items of work that they get done. And then making your policies explicit. So basically, knowing when things are done, knowing how the queues are set up, knowing how to change your WIP limits, all of those sorts of things. So you have to make sure that your policies are explicit for the group. So lean values. Let's talk a little bit about lean values. There's a lot on this slide, but what's important here is to talk about lean. So lean is, it's a continuous improvement technique. So it's basically a way to focus, on eliminating waste and really optimizing your processes. So the 3 main areas and that are important on this slide are quality, cycle time, and cost. So those are really the 3 main rules in lean that you need to focus on, and that's really important. And then all of these items on the left are the lean principles. So just like Agile has principles, lean also has principles as well, value being one of them. So that's similar to Agile, that customer value is key. But how it's achieved is different. So you have a value stream. So what you can do is you can have a dedicated room for your lean and Kanban processes, and you can go in and map out value streams. So let's say you have a process that you want to map out, maybe for a call center or calls coming in, and you want to see how the process starts from the time you receive the call to the time that the call is actually resolved. You can map each area of the workflow out on a board, right? So you can map out all your business processes in that fashion. So what you can do is look at your workflow of how it's running today And then the team can get together and actually talk about a future state of how things might be better. So that's what's important about doing value streams, is that you can really visualize the work. And then flow. So again, the concept of flow, which really what that means is the ability for the work to really move in a rhythmic fashion, but in a natural fashion, so that it moves from work queue to work queue. And then pull. That's where items are pulled from one queue to the other. So in Agile, they're pushed, or in Scrum, they're pushed, but in Lean, they're actually pulled. So that means that the work is not moved to the next queue until you actually have the capacity to do the work. And the reason for that is so that the work just doesn't sit in the queue, right? So in the Scrum environment, you can, if somebody just pushes things to a queue of development and, you only have 3 developers and you've got 30 items and you don't know how long it's going to take to get all of those done. And if you haven't sized your stories properly, then you could be in trouble. So this is, a technique that can be used, is that you're only pulling, as you need things. And then perfection. So you're really looking to eliminate any flaws or things like that. So that's where practices like continuous, development, continuous integration, all of that, and then also making sure that each line of code is quality. So it's not the quantity of the code, but the quality. And going back to Salesforce, that's one way that they were successful. I know how they basically were able to improve their processes when they were in trouble, was that they actually got the developers to write each line of code in a quality fashion, so that it was basically almost bug-free before they actually delivered it. So. And then reducing waste. So again, making sure that you go in and you find areas where you can reduce waste along each area of the steps of the process. So in getting back to quality, I'm not going to go through all these, but I'm going to go through a couple of the key points. So for quality, we've got kind of a comparison between Lean and Scrum. So in Lean, you have standardization. So when you think of standardization, and Toyota was one of the first folks that came with Lean, Kanban, and all these techniques. So for a car, right before you manufacture a car, you've got a die set, or you've got a pattern set to create that car, and have it set in a fashion that's the same, that's uniform. So it's the same idea for Lean delivery of software. You basically have a good template in place, and then you're ready to actually produce it and mass produce it rapidly, so that you have few lemons, like in the car world, right? So in Agile, we talked about Scrum at Scale and the practices. So Agile Scrum XP, what that relates to are the good practices, right? So having the good stand-ups, the good, the good backlog grooming, all of those types of things. That's ways that you can actually create that pattern. So that's how you can accomplish that using Scrum, is basically by having that uniform set of patterns, which Jeff Sutherland talks about, that you put into a Scrum at Scale model. For cycle time, optimal uses of resource, I'll use the top one there as well. So going and seeing yourself in the Lean environment. What that means is that if you were to map out value streams, you would actually go sit in where the customer is doing their work. So if I was doing a value stream, for Toyota, I would actually sit in the manufacturing floor and find a place where I could put the board up and start, and get the team to actually map things out. And so they're observing what's going on while they're coming up with the ideas. So they can really see how their customer is working. So in the software world, a lot of companies are doing that. Like, for example, some of our customers in banking, they have folks go in and get on the iPads actually at the banks, and often they bring their teams there, their UX, UI teams, and other design folks. So being able to actually be there on premises with the customer and get your team there for at least part of the time can actually be very optimal and actually help drive customer value, rather than just being siloed and thinking you're delivering something that will meet your customers' needs. So that's how you do it in Lean. How you do it in the Scrum Agile is where you have the customer close by. So you're not actually necessarily sitting there with them, but you try to get as close as you can. So you may occasionally go out and visit their site, observe what's going on, things like that. Or you can develop prototypes that you bring to the customer, have them look at, maybe have, CABs, customer advisory boards, things like that. So that's kind of how it's done in the, in the Scrum Agile world. But, Lean really, had it optimal, right? So really going there and seeing what the customer is doing is actually a great way to, to make sure that you understand your customer. And then getting into cost, so, things for efficiency and capability. So one of the things that we talked about in Kanban is pulling. So pulling, only moving things to a queue when you actually have the resources that can do the work is like a very important concept to Kanban to help reduce costs, because basically you're not putting more work in the system than the team, can achieve. And so in Scrum, you have things like the prioritized backlogs. You can do things like Scrumban, which is where you can blend Kanban techniques in the Scrum board. And then you can do things where you're doing feature focus and things like that. So that's kind of the equivalent in the Agile. And there's many more on this slide that you can look at after this. But at any rate, it's sort of some of the basics, for the differences between Lean and Scrum. So talking about Lean and Scrum as well, so we've got prescriptive versus adaptive. So prescriptive really means prescribed. So just like when you go to the doctors and you get a prescription and they give you a set of exact steps for taking that medicine, right, or for curing your illness. It's the same idea in the Agile world. So things that are more prescriptive have more rules. They have more steps, more things that you have to follow, right, that you would do. So one item that's more prescriptive is RUP, which is the rational user approach. That's almost, really more waterfall based, but it does have a large, set of steps and prescribed approaches that you use. XP, extreme programming, it is very rules based. So there are a lot of rules and ways to do XP. They do have a lot of Agile values in there, such as courage and collaboration and all that, but you really have to follow a lot of set of rules exactly to deliver XP properly. And then Scrum. Scrum is actually considered to be very prescriptive because of the ceremonies, right? So you have all the ceremonies, the stand-ups, the backlog grooming, all of those sorts of things that you're expected to do in a Scrum environment. So there are sets of rules that you're expected to follow there and ways that you're supposed to do your ceremonies as well. So, so there are sets of steps that are followed in the Scrum world. Then you get into Kanban, and that's considered less prescriptive because in the Lean world and the Lean values, you'll see that a lot of times the teams will do something called swarming, and we'll talk about that concept a little bit later. But if there's an item that's high priority in a Kanban team that needs to be addressed, like say you had an issue that's causing your whole site to go down, or some other issue that the whole team needs to attend to, they'll swarm together, and you can set up an expedited swim lane on your Kanban board to accommodate that and get the whole team to focus in on a problem. So, the rules are basically out of bounds there, right? So you can just pretty much, get the team to get in and work in the most efficient manner to get the project done. And then there's freestyle, right, which anything goes. So there are some companies that do that where they're just not really doing much of anything. They may be following some practices and principles, but they're doing a more freestyle approach. So they might just get everybody in the room and say, all right, so you just figure out how to get it done, right? So that's the opposite end of the spectrum. And then, they might use some techniques or a blended technique. But what's important here to really see the difference between Scrum and Kanban. So the key takeaway here is that Scrum is more prescriptive, has more rules, all the ceremonies and things like that, whereas Kanban does not. So getting into, Scrum and the prescribed roles, most of you probably know all about this already, so I'll go through it fairly quickly. It may be new to some of you. But in Scrum, one of the key roles is the product owner. So the role of the product owner really is to defining the features and owning the product, right? Owning the backlog, making sure that the product backlog is groomed, right? Following the good practices there. making sure that things are, really getting in the right order and that they're being put into the right sprint. So they own all of that. And then you've got the Scrum Master. So the Scrum Master really wants to make sure the team is functioning and productive. So one of the key areas and what's considered a good pattern is the stand-up. So you don't want the stand-up to just be a status meeting where the team is actually going through and just doing status every day. What you want to do is make sure that the Scrum Master is really working with the team, getting them to collaborate and remove impediments. And that's the pattern you want to follow, and that's the pattern you want to scale up. And then, of course, you got the team members. So ideally, in an Agile team, the team composition should be 7 plus or minus 2. And then the team works together and collaborates, self-organizing, and then they will, basically demo the product to the product owner, and they're responsible for, the quality of the product together. So everybody on the team is equally responsible for the product getting delivered. And then we've got some other, folks that are important as well, the executives. So they are very important to the team and an important person to have buy-in for Agile. So if you have an organization where the executives are not bought into Agile, then you may have resistance and problems because you're not going to get them to, agree to your initiatives or sign off or so you run into issues there. And then you have the stakeholders. Those are the individual, program stakeholders. They'll be the person that's usually responsible for the finances there, and the person that's going to, sponsor the different programs and things like that you have. So they have some different responsibilities there. And then, of course, they have to have the willingness to support the product owner as well and support the Agile initiative in the organization. So again, everybody's part of the team. And then, of course, you got the customer. Hopefully your customer is not a cowboy like that one is. But the customer is the one that's going to, important to work with. Again, if you can get the team to actually go in and do the go see yourself where you can work with the customer and really understand your product and your customer, that's great. If not, then, you do the next best thing where you get frequent visits, prototypes, things like that. But you do definitely want to have the feedback of the customers and, acknowledge the importance of that and build a product that has value. So basically in Scrum, we've got the Scrum prescribed iterations and the prioritized product backlog. So that's really the key. So you start out with identifying what the value is to the customer in the product that you're building. From there, then you go into your strategy, right? Your business strategy of how you're going to build the product, things that are going to go in. Then you have your enhancements and defects. And that might be from prior product releases, and those might go into your backlog along with new items. So depending on how you did your last release or your last sprint, then you might be updating your backlog. So again, it's the job of the product owner to be on top of all that, continuously be improving their backlog, so that they prioritize the work in a fashion that's going to be optimal to the team. And then from the product backlog, then we have the user stories, and then from there, then you're ready to go into the sprint and go into the iterations of 2 to 4 weeks, depending on what your organization does. Another activity that we didn't talk about is the Sprint Zero activities, which is really setting up all your environment and getting ready. Because if you go into that cycle and you're not ready, that can also have disastrous results. So if you don't have, all your testing processes in place, any of your automation software, if you're using that, and that is ideal to be using that, that's considered a good pattern, then you can get into trouble when you're actually doing your Agile delivery. And then at the end of the day, what you want to have is a shippable product. Something that's ready to go to the customer, ready to show to the customer. So that's what the team commits to as they go into the sprints and the releases. So again, things go in a requirement hierarchy where you're moving from low granularity, which is really the higher level customer scenario, to the high granularity, which is really when you're getting into your stories and your individual work tasks and things like that. So it goes in a continuum from what it is at a high level the customer wants and then how you end up getting there is really what this picture is showing you. So, from the customer scenario, then you've got what's called the feature set. So really that's just a list of features. That's what the product owner works on. And then from there, they put things into use cases. They put things into epics and stories. All of that goes into the backlog, and then it's actually produced in the sprint, to get your minimal viable product. And then user stories, it's important that you write the user stories well to be able to capture the value and the business requirements from the customer's perspective. So again, the idea of being able to visualize the customer and see what it is that they actually need when you're writing that story is important. So, the format of the story, and most of you probably already know this, but it's, you state as the user, I would like to perform some business function so that I can, accomplish something. So, and, when you're writing these, you want to be concise and you want to write stories so that, they do capture the exact requirements from the customer. And then also important when you're writing stories is the acceptance criteria, because at the end of the day, you want to have a story that's accepted by your product owner and that's going to meet the requirements of the customer. So not only writing the story, but knowing what the proper acceptance criteria is and having them on the story is like one of the good patterns that you want to follow. User story slicing. So this is something interesting because when you write user stories and you're actually building software, it actually slices through each area of the software. So what you're seeing here is if you write a story, and in this case, say this lady Sandy wants to enter her name and say it's on a website, right? So she can see it on the next page of the website. So you've got the UI component. So the story is crossing through the UI component. It's crossing through the business logic tier, through the database, and then also the hardware and the system. So what that means is that in each one of those areas, there's actually work to be done or something to support that story getting accepted. So that's the important part, right? So if you think about it, if you didn't have your database set up or you didn't have things synced from your stories, which is something that I've seen with teams, that they have all the development done, but then they don't have their database changes in place, then their acceptance criteria isn't going to work, right? Because the user's not going to see their name displayed if they can't pull it from the database. Or if you don't have the hardware set up properly and you can't access the system at the time you go to do your demo, then that's going to also impact it as well. So the point here is that when you write user stories, it actually does have a slice, like a piece of cake, that goes through the entire system. So another thing in Scrum that's prescriptive is the estimation. So, I think everybody knows story points. You can also set times. You can do things in hours or days on stories. So some folks do some stories like that, especially if they're things infrastructure related, because they know about how many days it might take or how many hours. But generally with things like features and epics and stories, you use planning poker, where you bring your stories to the team and then you have them size the stories. So at the beginning, of doing the planning poker, your teams might have more trouble, doing the sizing, that they're, not sure of the numbers. But then as they go through sprints, they learn, and then, then they have a better idea, throughout the next sprint of what the planning and the sizing will be, so that they get smarter and they work more efficiently. And then the total points for any given sprint is what's known as the velocity. So optimally, you want to see the velocity improve, from sprint to sprint, from release to release, so that you see that the team is getting smarter and more efficient. The rule of thumb for releases is usually, to improve by 20 to 30% ideally with your velocity. So that's what you want to strive for. It just all depends on the teams and how productive they work. So the Agile Scrum ceremonies, again, we've talked about the fact that these are prescriptive, so this is something that's prescribed in the Agile world of all these ceremonies that you do. So the release planning is, doing the backlog and the user story creation. That generally takes about 4 hours or so, and that's usually done before the sprint starts. The next item there is the sprint planning. So that's where the team gets through and does the story reviews and the team estimations and all of that work, the task creations, and then the commitment of the team to the velocity, because the teams all will commit together to how much velocity they think that they can achieve that sprint. And that's about 2 hours or so, and that's like the first day of the sprint as well. So the team will all get together and say, how many points they plan on producing that sprint, what's their velocity. And then the stand-ups, those are every day for 15 minutes. So again, that's just for visibility of the team, and that's the ability to remove impediments and just keep the productivity going so that you can get going. And then that'll go every day except for, at the beginning when you do the sprint planning. And then the demo, so at the end of the day, you want the working software. So, that depends. That's anywhere from, half hour to an hour, usually an hour. And then that's usually the last day of your sprint, right, when you're ready to, give the demo to the product owner and whoever else is interested in seeing that, getting feedback from that, and then the backlog will be groomed from there, and then items will go into the next sprint. And then the sprint review, so any retrospectives, backlog cleanups, reprioritization, that happens the last day of the sprint. And then you've got your retrospectives, so that's where you're reviewing the learning, and then you're doing your inspection and adaption. So that's for about an hour, and that's at the end of the sprint. Yes?
Is this based on sort of an average length for the sprint for these times?
Yeah, it's just an average time frame for how long you should take for each one of these. It's not, but usually for the 2 to 4 week sprints, this would be about the time that it would take for each one of these ceremonies. Does this seem right to you, or?
Well, yeah, I was just wondering if that was assumed to be more like a 2 week sprint, because I was thinking a 4 week sprint, those might be larger.
They might be a little bit larger with the 4 week sprint, so it's probably more for like a 2 week sprint. Yeah, it's for the smaller sprints, but it could go up from there. But ideally you're doing the smaller sprints, but every company's different. But yeah, if you had a 4 week sprint, you had more features and things like that, then some of these things would be longer. Some would be the same, like the stand-up would be the same, but some of the other ones, like the demos, if they had more things in there, it might be longer. It could be a 2 hour demo as well. So it could vary. This is just like a starting point, So then we talk about velocity. So velocity is the burn down chart, right, of the work items that are done. So at the beginning of the sprint, you start with a velocity that the team's committed to, and then ideally you get down to 0 by the end of the sprint, where you get everything done. So that's really what this is talking about. And so it's really the graphical representation of the work left to do versus time. And so that's really all the burn down is just tracking your work items. And then again, you're hoping that improves from sprint to sprint, release to release, so that the teams are more productive. And that usually does happen because as teams work together more frequently, they tend to start, getting through this and, increasing their productivity. And then burn-up charts. Now these are really for more of the feature-based items. So what the burn-up charts are about is when the product owner, goes through the backlog and decides on things to get done, they're going to choose the features that are going to have the most value to the customer first, as well as the company. So items that are really going to produce, the highest value and the highest ROI are going to be done first. And then those are shown in a burn-up chart to stakeholders and executives so that they can see, how the value is really realized when, delivering these different releases. So that's what the burn-up charts are about. So now that we've talked about Scrum, and I think all of you are pretty well versed in Scrum, we'll now move to Kanban, which will probably be more interesting for most of you. But Kanban, really all it means is signal card. So it is, a word in Japanese that means signal card, or the card you can see. So where it started out is in, again, with Toyota, used in the manufacturing world on the shop floor. So as they produced parts for cars, they actually had a card, for each item as it moved through the manufacturing and the production line for producing the car, so that it would go in an optimal fashion, and that only the exact number of parts for each one of the assemblies would be used, so that there was no waste. So that's where the Kanban cards started. Now they're used in software development, infrastructure, all of that. So, but we'll talk about the differences about how we use Kanban today, as per what David J. Anderson teaches. And then again, the Kanban evolved with the idea of it should be like water. So again, that principle of flow, where it's moving from queue to queue in a very rhythmic fashion and a very efficient fashion, so that again, as items come into the system, they're being, they're not remaining there for a long period of time and staying stagnant, right? So it's kind of like if you have stagnant water in a bowl and it starts to rot out and smell, right? You don't want it to stay there. Same thing with work items on a Kanban board. You want it to keep moving through the system, right, and be able to flow from queue to queue. So that's a really important concept in Kanban. And then in Kanban, you start with what you do and Kanbanize it. And what that means is that everything you do, you could actually put on a Kanban board. So, for any kinds of items, for example, for our staffing business, we actually have a Kanban board in our Dallas office, where each one of the tasks that we do for, for the recruitment process and everything like that is mapped out on a Kanban board, where you can actually see the work getting pulled in. And then as people are available to actually work on the different work items, the items are pulled and it's visible to the entire team. So with anything you can do, and actually my dentist's office last week, they had an Agile board up there, so it's interesting. So everybody's starting to use Scrum and Agile and Kanban and everything like that. So it's basically saying, like, with anything you do, you could actually, have your own Kanban board. I actually have one at my desk, so that's what they're talking about when you Kanbanize something. And then change is evaluating first using metrics to really improve, the customer or stakeholder value. So again, that gets to the lean startup principle, right? Where you take that learning item, right, the validated learning, and then you build that into the next iteration of the process. So that's really where you're using, lean startup principles there. And so how to implement Kanban. Again, we talked about Kanbanizing things. So this is an example of a Kanban board. So this is an example of a software application. So you've got your, for your business analyst, you've got all of their items. So they might have a request to get their, their business requirements done, which you see in the first queue. And then you've got the WIP set to 4. So, simplistic version, maybe you've got 4 business analysts there. And then for the requirements phase, we're saying that we can set, the WIP to 3 there, ideally. And then it'll be pulled into the requirements only when the resources are, can take on the work, and then move to the done. And then from there, they can go to the design. So depending on what kind of, item you're building, if it's a UI component, then maybe when the UI team members are ready to do the design, then you could pull it into the next queue. And then for the build, maybe an entirely different team is starting to do the build and the development, so only when the resources are available for that, then it gets pulled in. And then, moving to test, so when the QA folks are ready, they can pull it into the test queue. And then, deploy when it's ready to get delivered, and then done. So again, you want to see things moving continuously from queue to queue. You don't want any one item staying there. That's one rule. You don't want any one item staying there. And you don't want the WIP to back up and get into what's called a bottleneck, right? So if you go over the WIP, say you have 6 items line up, then you have what's called the bottleneck. And then you've got downstream flow, so you just want to see the process moving continually. And then again, the lean flow, principles is only pull based on capacity, right? And the WIP levels should be finished before starting new work. So you always want to finish any work in process. So swarm, we talked about swarming a little bit earlier. So that just means in a lean team when there's a problem, an issue, maybe, if you get somebody that puts a bug in your system or, something like that, where, it shuts your whole site down, then you obviously have to get the whole team on deck, all hands on deck to actually get things done. And so in Kanban, what you can do is just create a swim lane, they call them swim lanes, down at the bottom, and then the whole team can actually work together and get that item done. So it's really just a priority, high priority lane or way of getting work done. So it's called swarming. So the lean agile value stream, so we talk about flow, we talk about waste. So basically, lean uses, principles and tools to map the value stream, optimize the flow, and then remove waste and solve problems. Whereas agile, we talked about the ceremonies, we talked about the roles, we talked about the practices, all those types of things. That's how an agile project delivers value. So, again, you kind of see the difference there. But again, any system is only, efficient as the resources that are available and that the time will allow. So none of these methods is really a silver bullet. And as we know, even agile itself is not a silver bullet to solving all problems within an organization. So you do have to have the talent in place. You do have to make sure that you have buy-in from the organization, along with a lot of other factors. And then if you have all the the good fundamentals in place, and of course in a technology company and a lot of companies in the Bay Area, innovation is important. If you don't have innovation on the team, then the teams are going to fail. So if you had a non-innovative team and you gave them Agile or you gave them Kanban or any of these things, they may not necessarily be successful because they can't build a product that's going to satisfy the customer because they lack innovation, right? So again, these are just tools, just like you use your knife and your fork to eat, but really optimally, it's really what the organization is also going to support and other talents of the team that will come into play here to determining how efficient any one of these practices could possibly be. So Toyota Kanban. So we talked about Toyota really being the originator of Kanban, which is true. So it started out with manufacturing. So again, wanting to have that uniform die in place, so that when you manufacture cars, you create the same car time and time again with the highest amount of quality, the lowest cost and number of defects. You don't want any lemons, right? So I don't know if any of you have ever bought a lemon car, but you don't want to be the person to get the lemon. So as I spoke about before, you have a Kanban card, only the exact number of parts are pulled, for each item on that card, and then they're moved through different flows of the process. So what you're seeing here is that the part, instructor goes through, and then the card moves through the system, and then the item's only pulled when the team's ready to produce, the part. But what's important about this is just the principles and the reduction of waste in every area, of the process flow, which is really where the lean processes come into place. And then, again, in Japanese practices, when they did production like this, they really accelerated themselves because they built very high quality products. And they ended up, becoming the leader, in automobile manufacturing at the time, because they had innovative products, but also because they used, they built something with a high area of quality, and then they, kept their waste down and, reduced costs as well. So they had the whole package together. So that's how they were able to be very successful. So again, this went into the software world. So now, in today's world, and this is the David J. Anderson School of Kanban, now we are in a service-oriented model. So, the Toyota Kanban, a lot of those principles and practices are a good foundation for how we do Kanban today, but we needed a more contemporary approach. So what David J. Anderson came up with was the service-based Kanban method. He has years of implementation Kanban in different environments, manufacturing as well as in more the software and service level. So, when we talk about everything today, everything's a service, right? Software is a service. You log into websites and things like LinkedIn and all of that, and companies are providing services. So the need for a Kanban approach that really supports a service level model is really important and key to organizations. So that's why This is a great method that supports a lot of contemporary areas. Call centers are service-oriented. When you're putting infrastructure in, that's considered a service because you're actually putting a server in, you're taking a request, for a service order or a ticket, right, at a service desk. So that's considered a service request. So there's a lot of, different applications of so-called service that are either, basic like help desk or more advanced like the SaaS models. So you can go either way. So again, any creative work is service-oriented. So, when you get together and you're building things, you want to decide what kind of service it's providing your customer. Also, there's workflows for service delivery. So for any kind of item that you're doing, whether it's a SaaS software, whether it's a help desk, whether it's a website, all those things, still require the workflow mapping. So just like, you had to do for Toyota where they did workflows and parts and things like that, you would still need to do that for software. And then you want to have the knowledge discovery activity. So a lot of them use the lean principles, like the go see yourself, and some of the other ones that were used at Toyota, and then there's some new ones as well, right? But, basically what you want to do is use the knowledge of the team, be able to visualize the workflow, and then be able to improve upon it by finding ways to reduce waste. And then again, the thing to do is map out the workflow. So do the the value stream mappings and things like that we talked about before. Do identify any service requests for new work by really gauging your customer, maybe going to their site, interviewing them, getting the qualitative and the quantitative data, where you're learning, you're doing the validated learning, like the lean startup principle, right? Not how the product should be built, but should the product be built, right? So really understanding what it is your customer wants and deciding whether or not you should really invest your time in building that product in order to eliminate waste as well. And then track the work flowing through the service. So be able to track each item, set the WIP levels, and make sure it's going efficient once you actually do get that item live into production. So here's an idea of what a Kanban card might look like, and you can set dates. So what's important here is, the date the feature was requested. So maybe that's the date that it was put into the system. And then you would have a start date and a delivery date. So those are important things to track in Kanban because you have two important metrics in Kanban, which are known as cycle time and lead time. So the cycle time, and we'll talk about them in a later slide, but the cycle time is how long it takes it to get from the start date to the end date, whereas the lead time is the entire time that the product's in the system. So, one example of that, an easy example is a Disneyland ride, right? So you're waiting in line at Space Mountain, and it says it's going to take you 60 minutes to get on the ride, right? So how that can be measured is the total number of people that go on the ride could be the total WIP, which is, say, 2,400, and then you have 40 people exiting the ride every minute, and that's how they get that 60-minute mark. So they actually do use what's called Little's Law, which we'll see on the next slide, which is the throughput rate times the lead time. So in order to tell how much time it takes, which is the cycle time, for something to get through the system, based on the start date and the end date, is what's known as Little's Law, and that's one of the key equations for a lean Kanban system that you want to know. But the ride example is an important one. Yes, sir?
What is your start time on the previous slide? How was that start time? Is it that feature requested or the work started?
No, the work started. Yeah, the feature requested is just when the actual feature would get built. And then it actually goes into the system or in play on the board at the start date. And that's how you calculate the cycle time. So at any rate, that's an easy example of Little's Law is the Disneyland ride, right? So when you get the different minutes for how long it should take you to get on that ride is how they would do that. They just use Little's Law there. So burn down is less important in a Kanban world than the cycle time or the lead time. So those are really the lead metrics. So again, you don't want any items staying stagnant in the system. It's like bad water, right? It's just things don't flow through the system. You have a lot of features that are built and requested, and they never get into starting or finishing. Then you've got you've got a non-optimal set of processes there. And then here's the Kanban metrics again. So here's the lead and the cycle time. So an example of the lead time. So again, that's when the feature's requested. So it took, in this case, 15 days for 15 user stories. Whoops. But the cycle time itself, the start date and the end date was 8 days. So in other words, the feature came into the system 15 days before. So it sat there for 15 days before it actually entered into the work queues and started going. And then it took 8 days to get done. So when the start date hits is when the work actually starts. And then assessing the depth of the Kanban implementation, you can use what's called a radar chart and then measure different areas of value. So again, these are just metrics you can use for your validated learning that we talked about. So this is some of them that you could use. So you can, measure how good your visualization worked, like how good did your workflow mapping, work, how efficient it was. How good was your limiting of your WIP? How efficient was that? How much did it help your flow? You're managing the flow, that can also be measured. Your policies, that can be measured. Your feedback loops, like how much feedback from the customer, how efficient was that? And then your collaboration. And there's a lot of other items you could put on a radar chart. I mean, this is just an example of some of them. But radar charts are just a way that you could measure the efficiency of really any implementation, whether it's Scrum or Kanban. But this is just an example of how you could possibly measure whether or not your Kanban implementation was efficient or not. And so to sum it up, really, the differences between Scrum and Kanban, in this slide, the summary here. So for Scrum, all the time box iterations, the number of time it takes to get through that sprint is prescribed, so 2 to 4 weeks, depending on what your team names it, or maybe another time frame. Some companies actually do longer than 4 weeks, but at any rate, it's prescribed, right? It's a certain set of time that it takes for you to get through that Scrum cycle. Whereas in Kanban, the work's continuously going through the system, so that's why it works well for infrastructure. It can also work well for other items like, say, reports, which don't really go into a release. Maybe database items, things like that, because it's not really things that are packaged together in a release of shippable software. In Scrum, the team commits to a certain amount of work, whereas in Kanban, the commitment's optional. So the teams in Kanban don't commit to the work, but they only pull the work in when they're available. So they never have that team commitment because they don't really do the stand-ups. Using the velocity for the default metric, so that's the metric in Scrum that we talked about. So that's the key one in Scrum. Whereas in Kanban, the lead time and then the cycle time are really the important metrics there. For Scrum, the cross-functional teams are prescribed. In Kanban, they're optional. So you can have them, but you don't have to have them. For Scrum, the items should be broken down so they're completed in one sprint, so you want to write your stories really small. Whereas in Kanban, no particular item size is prescribed, but you do want to have your WIP set so that you can move items through the system. The burn down chart is prescribed in Scrum, whereas in Kanban, there's no particular type of diagram. You're just really going through the Little's Law, right, to do your metrics or maybe some other efficiencies like Monte Carlo forecasting. In Scrum, the WIP is limited indirectly, so there's not really any WIP limit set. It's indirect, whereas in Kanban, it's direct. So you directly set the WIP limits. For Scrum, the estimation is prescribed, so you do have estimations that are prescribed, whereas in Kanban, the estimations are optional. So you can do them, but you don't have to do them. In Scrum, you cannot add items to an ongoing iteration. So once the Scrum cycle's in process, you can't add them. Whereas in Kanban, you can add items to the queues when the capacity is available. So if you have capacity to do a work item, you could put the item in the queue. There's no rule against that. But in the sprint, once you have your items in there and your backlog, you're not supposed to put any new items in there because the team only committed to that particular set of work items. In Scrum, you have the 3 prescribed roles, right? The product owner, the Scrum Master, and the team. In Kanban, there are no roles prescribed. There's all kinds of players on a Kanban team. For the Scrum boards are reset every sprint, so your velocity goes down to 0, and ideally, your Scrum board is reset, and then you start out with everything in the backlog for the new sprint. In Kanban, the board's always there. You never wipe the board clean, right? The board is always in its current state, and then you're just moving from queue to queue. And then in Scrum, you have the prioritized product backlog, and in Kanban, the prioritization is optional. So you can't do it, but it is optional.